For decades, Michaels have dominated our society. From the 1960s to the 1990s, Michael is by far the most popular baby name for boys. And even today, while other names have overtaken it, there are still a considerable amount of Michaels living among us. And this reality is very much reflected on Survivor, where despite there being nearly 700 players to have played the game across over 40 seasons, there have been 12 Michaels to have played the game. And sure, while they go by different names like Michael, Mikey, Mike, they have permeated our screens for over 2 decades, and they have been behind some of the biggest moments in Survivor history, and these players have made more than their fair share in defining the game as well as the television show. And they've also had a very wide range of success on Survivor, ranging from early exits to sitting before a final tribal and everything else in between. And in this video, I plan to tell their story, document their rises and falls, their highest points and their lowest points, and to see their legacy play out across the show. This is the history of Mikes on Survivor. Our story begins in the year 2001. Following the success of its first season, Survivor was now a part of the mainstream. Everyone was talking about it. Buzz surrounded season 2, and everyone and their mom sent in audition tapes hoping to be cast. Sure enough, 16 lucky Americans got the call saying they would be on season 2 of Survivor, and one of them is Michael Skupin, the first Michael to play the game. Skupin was an interesting prospect for the show, as despite him being a mere software publisher from Michigan, he described himself as adventurous, a thrill seeker, and a risk taker. And when he arrived on Survivor, he was sure to make that part of his experience. He was determined to make himself the leader of the Kucha tribe, taking every opportunity that he could to go out fishing and trying to get some food. And while he was largely unsuccessful on the fishing front, he did successfully hunt down a wild pig, which definitely sparked some controversy in the fandom, although the bloodshed that day was more than enough in Skupin's mind. On the screen, Skupin was definitely presented as a joke, more of a big character than a serious player, although he really did seem to be the leader for a lot of the pre-merge, as he led his tribe to winning 3 immunity challenges in a row. And yes, while they did have to cut Deb and Kimmy along the way, Skupin seemed to be emerging as the leader figure that he set out to be, being perfectly positioned between 2 pairs with Elizabeth and Roger on one side and Alicia and Varner on the other side, and with Kucha coming just 1 immunity win away from having a 6-4 numbers advantage coming to the merge. Skupin seemed poised to reach at least the final 6 based purely off tribal lines, and from there he could have made a final 3 deal with one of the other pairs, ensuring that he made it very deep into the game. However, that all changed on day 17, which started off as a pretty normal day with Skupin tending to the fire and the Kuchas preparing for this all-important immunity challenge. But then, seemingly out of nowhere, the 31 million people that were tuning into this episode heard a blood-curdling scream as the camera cut to Skupin sitting next to the fire, his hands reached out in utter agony. Before the other Kuchas could get a sense of what had happened, Skupin was on his feet as he raced towards the water, diving headfirst. It turned out that Skupin had inhaled some smoke while tending to the fire, causing him to temporarily pass out and to fall hands first right into the flames. As the other Kuchas looked on in horror, the camera zoomed in on Skupin sitting in the water, eyes clenched in agony as he lifted his hands out of the water, revealing the large mess of skin that was peeling off of his fingers as he spoke. He wonders aloud if he should keep trying to bend his fingers or not, to which the other Kuchas say that he shouldn't. By then, the medics were on the scene, and after looking at his wounds, they determined that they were too severe to be treated on location, and that Michael would have to be removed from the game. This was a first for Survivor, as Skupin became the first player to be medically evacuated from the game. And to many viewers, it was a clear indication that the conditions that the players were facing on the show were very much real. Although it didn't detract from the show's popularity, there was a belief that the show had been scripted and that the players were actually treated very well on the island. However, Skupin falling into the fire clearly put this myth to rest. Skupin's removal had a massive impact on the rest of the season. The immunity challenge was cancelled, meaning that Kucha entered the merge tied in numbers, and they ultimately lost the numbers after losing the tiebreaker due to previous votes. The Kuchas were never able to fully recover and were eventually picked off one by one, much like the Pagongs from Season 1. But even beyond its impact on the game, Skupin falling into the fire remains one of the most iconic moments in Survivor history, coming at a time where the show was at its peak popularity, and to this day, even people that no longer know that Survivor is even still on the air recognize that moment and can tell you where they were when Skupin fell into the fire. It's a moment that forever defined the show's legacy, and for years people were clamoring for Skupin to have a second chance. Would he get it? Only time would tell. Similar to Kelly's, Michaels had a bit of a layoff during the show's formative years, as it wouldn't be for another 14 seasons that we would see another Michael play again. Fast forward to Season 16, Survivor Micronesia, Fans vs. Favorites, and of the thousands of fans that Survivor could have picked from, one of the lucky ones was Michael Bortone, or as he liked to go by, Mikey B. Mikey B found himself in an interesting position early on, as he was credited on the show with building the initial majority alliance, along with his closest ally in Mary, and at first, Mikey B seemed poised to control that early vote. However, things got a bit confusing when Tracy, one of the outsiders, was sent to Exile Island. While this seemed trivial on paper, Tracy had actually gotten individual immunity during the first challenge, which was only valid through the first tribal that she attended. Through this, Mikey B really wanted to weigh out all the options over whether to vote out Kathy or Chet, and on the show at least, this was presented as him overplaying, as Joel was quick on the scene to flip the numbers against Mikey B, who he saw as the biggest threat. However, rather than voting out Mikey B directly, he decided to land the numbers onto Mary, who was Mikey B's closest ally and someone who didn't really offer much to really anyone outside of Mikey B. Through that, Mikey B was immediately on the outs, blindsided at that first tribal. And things didn't get too much better at the next tribal, where despite him trying to throw the numbers on the Chet, who was the physically weakest on the tribe, it ultimately didn't work and Mikey B himself was voted out next. Overall, it was pretty anticlimactic for Mikey B to be this early of an exit, and while the show presented it as him overplaying, it's also very possible that he just sketched out a lot of people to where people were unwilling to let him dominate the game to the extent that he wanted to. But on the whole, a relatively minor figure in Survivor history. Our next Michael comes just 3 seasons later, although judging by the switch to HD, you would be forgiven for thinking he was at least 10 years. However, here we have Mike Borassi. Placed in the Fofoa tribe, Mike was the oldest player on the entire cast, and one would think based on that he would be targeted early on as a physical weakness, although surprisingly, no one ever brought up his name as a potential target. At the first tribal, he did initially target Ashley, although once he saw the numbers were coming out to Marissa, he was wise enough to flip his vote onto Marissa, ensuring that he would be in the majority. But then we get to the next immunity challenge, which is now the infamous Smurgan Brawl, which was a very violent challenge and very injury-prone challenge. So violent in fact that Ben Browning was even ejected from the challenge for being a bit too rough. It makes you wonder why production thought this was ever a good idea, but no one was hit harder by this challenge than Mike, who was absolutely decimated in this challenge, to the point where he started breathing heavily, and he even appeared disoriented after taking a few hits. And it got to the point where after the challenge, Jeff even had to bring in the medical team to look at him, and it was there that they found that Mike's blood pressure had dropped dramatically, to the point where they actually had to pull him from the game, which at the time was the earliest medevac in Survivor history. And the craziest part is that despite this challenge resulting in a medevac, they decided to use it again just 1 season later in Heroes vs. Villains. Really goes to show how much they learned their lesson. But as for Mike, yes, it was an early exit, and I don't have much faith that he would have done well even if he had stayed in the game. However, he still proved to be a capable player and one that was at least aware of his limitations. But as it stood, we were now over 3 with Mikes on Survivor. Although, in the years to come, things would get a bit more interesting. You see, Mike Borassi would end up being the last Mike as a Survivor 43 to be taken out of the game in the pre-merge. What we were about to see was pretty crazy, all things considered, and it would start just 3 seasons later in Survivor Redemption Island, where we have Mike Chiesl, an Iraq war veteran placed on the Zapatero tribe, And Mike was a very interesting prospect. While the show definitely focused a lot on his military background and brought him up as this American hero, he definitely proved to be a capable player as people instantly gravitated towards him, and he easily found himself in the majority alliance. Early on, things were complicated on Zapatera. On one hand, they enjoyed some challenge success, winning the first two immunity challenges and gaining a numbers advantage over the Ometepes, but on the other hand, Mike and the other members of his alliance were uneasy with Russell Hantz, who was selected to be on their tribe, and after seeing him dominate Samoa in Heroes vs Villains, they were afraid that he would try the same tricks again to dominate the game, namely through him finding idols and him building alliances with other women. And this culminated in episode 3, where they had a very interesting dilemma to face: either allow themselves to continue to build on their numbers advantage, or throw the challenge and get rid of Russell now so that they can focus more on the rest of the game. Ultimately, Mike and his alliance chose to throw the next immunity challenge in a pretty blatant fashion, allowing Boston Rob to complete the puzzle and all but ensuring that Russell will be the next boot. And while Russell tried to intimidate the rest of the tribe, saying that he had found an idol, the reality was that Ralph had found the idol instead and was pretty open about it with his alliance, so that wasn't much of a concern. And sure enough, at the next tribal, they split the vote, sending out Russell on the revote, and to add a cherry on top, Russell lost the next Redemption Island duel, ensuring that he was out of the game for good. On the whole, it was a pretty interesting success story, and they even won the next immunity challenge, putting Zapatera at an 8-6 numbers advantage. Unfortunately, that's where the fortune stopped for Zapatera as they dropped the next 3 immunity challenges. And while Mike was in a solid position to where he was never directly targeted during that stretch, it still wasn't great, as it ultimately caused Zapatera to come into the merge down 6-5, which then grew to 7-5 when Matt from the original Ometepe tribe came back into the game through Redemption Island, sending them down 7-5. Now, in reality, there was definitely opportunities for Zapatera to gain the numbers, as Matt was obviously blindsided by his old Ometepe tribe, and there were even some outsiders that they could pull over as well. Unfortunately, Boston Rob had such a stranglehold over the Ometepes that none of them were willing to flip, and even Matt, who did consider flipping at one point, ultimately decided to stay with the Ometepes at the end of the day. Now, in an interesting twist, Boston Rob did decide to flip the vote against Matt Elrod, sending him back to Redemption Island, and he certainly had the numbers to do so, but even then, the Zapateras were left completely out of this plan, to the point where Ralph wasted his idol on Mike, which was the one saving grace that the Zapateras could have had in the post-merge. And now, even with the Ometepes burning one of their own, the Zapateras were essentially sitting ducks at that point, as they had no means of countering what was essentially an insurmountable majority. And sure enough, Mike was the next victim, being picked off by the Ometepes and sent to Redemption Island. During his time on Redemption, Mike won 4 duels, or I guess trials, or quadruels, but regardless, it was very apparent that Mike was built pretty well for these challenges. Now, during his time, he did have a very interesting choice to make after one of these wins, which happened during the Loved Ones visit, where he had the choice of either giving the Loved Ones reward to the players on Redemption Island, which included himself, or to give it to the players still in the game, in the hope of potentially currying some favor if he were to return to the game. And in an interesting choice, he chose to give it to the players still in the game, which was a bit of a questionable choice, as on one hand, you can understand his logic of wanting to curry favor with the Ometepes in the event that it came back into the game, which, judging by his challenge prowess, was definitely a possibility. But on the other hand, considering how much of a stranglehold Boston Rob had over the Ometepes still in the game at that point, it was very unlikely that this would have amounted to much anyway. In any event, Mike got all the way to the final duel, where he just needed to win one more challenge to get back into the game. But unfortunately, Andrea beat him out on it, and he was sent to the jury, along with all the other Zapateras. Ultimately, I think Mike was one of the better players from the season, as he was definitely the most likely winner of these Zapateras, given that he was very well liked by them, to the point where he was never considered a target during the pre-merge, and he was very capable in challenges to where even if he had gotten back into the game and been targeted, that he could have potentially won those last few immunity challenges. And had he gotten to the end, the Zapateras probably would have rewarded him with the win, but considering that his tribe was down the numbers at the merge, on a season where the majority was very tight and very unlikely to flip, he simply didn't have much wiggle room. And with that, Mike Chiesl was wiped out. Our next Michael came just 2 seasons later on Survivor One World, and here we have Michael Jefferson placed on the Monono tribe, aka the men's tribe. Early on, it did seem that Michael was part of the majority, as he built an alliance with a lot of the other alpha males in Bill, Jay, and Matt. However, it wasn't long before the 5 outsiders came together and formed the Misfits alliance led by Colton, and he led the charge against Matt at the first tribal that they went to. Michael was completely left in the dark during his vote, as even his own allies in Bill and Jay picked up on the plan and flipped their votes to Matt accordingly, leaving Michael to throw his vote onto Bill for whatever reason. And things didn't get much better when, after Monono won an immunity challenge, Colton was so fed up with Bill that he decided to give up immunity to allow the tribe to go to tribal after winning the immunity challenge, and Michael just decides to go along with this for whatever reason. Now granted, the other men went along with it as well, but still, the fact that Michael was allowing Bill to enter the crosshairs was pretty bad, and Michael even joined the rest of the tribe in voting out Bill. Michael then got an interesting swap where on one hand he was placed in the new Solani tribe, which did seem to be the more physical tribe that won the next couple of challenges. However, he was down the numbers as the women had the majority there, and even then he was outplayed by Jay and Troyzan, who did more to build bonds with Kim and Chelsea, who were the power players at that point, while Michael was more or less left on his own. And it's very possible that had Solani gone to tribal during this phase of the game, that he would have been voted out pretty easily there. But again, Solani was able to win the next couple of challenges, ensuring that that didn't happen. At the merge, it seemed that Michael was in the majority, as it seemed that Kim could have gone with the post-Solani group and dominated the game from that point on. However, unknown to Michael and really the rest of the guys, Kim and the other women chose to stick together and pick off the men one at a time. And while Michael was successful in voting out Jonas at that first tribal, he still rubbed Jonas and Leaf the wrong way to where they targeted him regardless, which wasn't great. However, even then, it would only get worse at the next round, where it turned out that Kim wasn't siding with the post-Solani group after all, and she was pretty effective in manipulating Michael and the other men to targeting each other, thinking that they were after each other, not realizing that the true power in the game lied with the women. And sure enough, all this worked in Kim's favor, as Michael was then taken out at the next tribal. Ultimately, I would consider this Michael to be a disappointment, as on one hand, he didn't make it to the merge, and on paper seemed to be in the majority on some votes, but when you really look at it, he didn't really have any allies at any point, and was more or less dangling in the game for a lot of it, and probably would have been taken out sooner had his tribe gone to more tribals in the pre-merge. And even then, he did things that rubbed some people the wrong way, to where he was targeted at that first row after the merge. But as it stood, despite him making it to the merge, Michael Jefferson was another loss for the Michaels. By the fall of 2012, Survivor was in what many fans considered to be a dark age. Following the success of Heroes vs. Villains, it seemed that the next 4 seasons were largely disappointing in comparison. And while you can debate the merits of these seasons, it is pretty clear that these seasons were simply not as popular as Heroes vs. Villains, and that the show was in a pretty noticeable hangover, having to rely a lot on returning players and random twists that weren't quite panning out. And while Survivor Philippines is remembered today as one of the show's best seasons, it still had some of the features that people weren't happy with the dark age of Survivor, namely with the returning players. And Survivor Philippines would bring back not 2, but 3 returning players, in the first season since Survivor All-Stars to have 3 starting tribes. For this season, they wanted to bring back 3 players that were previously medically evacuated, and while Jonathan Penner and Russell Swan were pretty logical picks in this regard, there was one player that you simply could not do this theme without, and that is Michael Skupin, the original medevac from Survivor. Skupin was placed on the Tandang tribe, which ultimately proved to be the more successful tribe, as they never attended a single tribal in the pre-merge, and initially it seemed that Skupin was in a power position, as he was part of the majority alliance, along with RC, Abby, Maria, and Pete. Although later on that position did deteriorate a bit, as Abby, Maria, and Pete were able to flip Lisa and Artister's side, leaving out Michael and RC. Even so, Tandang kept winning challenges, so this wasn't too much of an issue for Skupin. When he finally went to tribal at the merge, things got a little wonky, where an idle play resulted in him losing RC, and there was a concern that he and Penner could be targeted due to them being returning players. However, Skupin was able to regroup, building a very close bond with Lisa Welchel, who he had previously targeted in the pre-merge, and through their relationship with Malcolm and Denise, the two remaining Matt Singh members, they were essentially able to dominate a lot of the post-merge, picking off most of the big threats outside their alliance, which included the old Calabals and even people like a Pete and an Artist. And by the final 5, Skupin was in a pretty prime position to get to the final 3, but Skupin saw this as more than simply getting to the end of the game. In his mind, he was the hero of the season, the biggest player, and the one that would crush everyone left in the game, and show to the entire viewing world that he was the great player that he knew himself to be at the time of the Australian Outback. All he had to do was get there. Final 5 was easy enough, where he successfully took out Abby Maria, despite others calling him a moron for not dragging her to the end as a goat, but that didn't matter to him, because he beats everyone. At the final 4, despite Malcolm having an advantage that allowed him to have a second chance in the challenge, Skupin crushed him nonetheless, ensuring that he would be the first Michael to reach Final Tribal, and as far as he knew, he had already won the game. Whoever sat next to him didn't matter, and sure enough, Denise did flip against Malcolm despite working with him all game, sending him to the jury, and with that, Michael had reached Final Tribal, facing off against Lisa Welchel, a celebrity that already had money and certainly didn't need more, and Denise, who despite having played a solid game all around, had made the grave mistake of allowing Skupin to get all the way to the end, and as the three of them walked into Final Tribal on day 39, Skupin knew he had this in the bag. He was the only returning player to make it to the end, despite them having a target on their back at points. He was the lovable Skupin that fell into the fire and had finally come back after all these years, and despite that, target had still gone all the way to the end, showing to the world just how great of a player that he was. Certainly, there was no way this guy could lose, right? Well, as Skupin found out the hard way, that's not how the jury saw it. Despite him never getting a vote against him the entire season, a lot of the jury actually saw that as a negative, showing how they never really saw him as that big of a threat despite him being a returning player. Now, to Skupin's credit, he does give an alright tribal performance, to the point where he actually gets Carter's vote in the process. However, it wasn't enough, as the jury was more impressed by Denise's underdog story during the season, and her just coming off as more respectable to the jury, to the point where she demolishes Skupin in a 6-1-1 jury vote. And while it's certainly impressive that Skupin was able to get all the way to the end, despite him going out relatively early his first time, and despite him being one of the few returning players on a mostly newbie cast, it was still a disappointment in Skupin's eyes. He had the $1 million and the crown right in his hands, but it wasn't. And even after he left the island, and even after the cameras were turned off, his story didn't end there. In December 2013, a year after Philippines finished airing, allegations surfaced that Skupin's business, Pay It Forward, had been involved in a Ponzi scheme, which prompted an investigation.
You don't have to sell anything.
But the product's money. The product's just money.
You just hand over your money to Mike. You'll get put on this kind of pyramid-looking chart.
And as if that wasn't bad enough, during the investigation, police discovered child pornography on his laptop, which added additional charges on top of the Ponzi scheme allegations. When all was said and done, Skupin was charged and found guilty of 4 counts of possession of child pornography, and he pled no contest to a single count of larceny by conversion as part of a plea deal due to the Ponzi scheme investigation. Skupin was sentenced to serve 1 to 4 years in prison for possession of child pornography, as well as 4 years probation and $31,800 in restitution for larceny. He served 1 year in prison before being released on parole in December of 2017. Michael Skupin had one of the most dramatic falls from grace of any player that has played Survivor. At the time he first played, he was seen as a lovable doofus, a wannabe leader, and someone who was well remembered for falling into the fire, and people felt bad for him. And even at the time that he came back, people were somewhat supportive of his play and were happy to see him get a second chance and for him to be relatively successful on his second go around. But today, Skupin is one of the most reviled members of the Survivor community, and for good reason as well. Even so, it's hard to overstate the impact that he's had on the show, of bringing the show into cultural relevance, and the impact that him falling into the fire and his rise and fall has had over the course of Survivor history. But even with the close calls, the fact that Skupin never won Survivor is probably for the better.